The smell of roasted chicken still lingered in the kitchen of my son's modest two-story home in suburban Ohio. It was one of those rare evenings when I allowed myself to slow down, to step away from the paperwork stacked high on my office desk. My son, Matthew, sat across from me, cracking jokes about how badly I still over-salt my mashed potatoes. For a moment, I felt almost normal again, a father enjoying dinner with his grown child. Then my phone buzzed. At first, I thought it was just another client or one of my employees ignoring the after-hours boundary. But when I glanced at the screen, I saw the name, Tom Reynolds, my neighbor back in Cincinnati. A practical, level-headed man in his 50s, Tom wasn't the type to call without reason. I excused myself from the table and stepped into the living room to answer. "Hey, Tom," I said, keeping my voice low. "Everything okay?" There was a pause on the other end, heavy, hesitant. Then his voice came through, edged with confusion. "David," he said, "who's at your place right now?" I frowned, pressing the phone tighter against my ear. "What do you mean? Nobody's there. I'm out of town, having dinner with Matt." Another pause. I could hear the faint hum of Tom's porch light buzzing, like he was standing outside. Finally, he spoke again, slower this time, like he didn't quite believe what he was seeing. "Well, somebody is inside your house. Lights are on." I saw movement through the living room window. Looked like a man. My chest tightened. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I'd always been meticulous, double-checking the locks, installing a security system, making sure nothing could disturb the order I fought so hard to keep. The thought of someone being inside my home, my private space filled with memories of my late wife, was unbearable. I lowered my voice to a whisper, as if the stranger might somehow hear me across the miles. "Tom, are you sure?" "I wouldn't call if I wasn't," he replied, firm but uneasy. "Do you want me to go check it out?" 1,000 thoughts collided in my head. What if it was just a trick of the light? What if it was an intruder with dangerous intentions? Worse, what if it was someone who knew me, someone who had a reason to be there? I glanced back toward the kitchen, where Matthew was laughing at something on the TV, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in my chest. My instinct screamed at me not to alarm him yet, not until I knew for sure. "No," I finally said, forcing steadiness into my voice. "Don't go inside. Just stay on your porch. Keep an eye out. I'll handle this." As I ended the call, my reflection stared back at me in the darkened window. My own face looked like a stranger's, jaw clenched, eyes shadowed with dread. Something told me that whatever Tom had seen wasn't just a trespasser. This was the beginning of something bigger, something that would unravel pieces of my life I thought I'd buried long ago. I turned back toward Matthew, my heart hammering so loudly it drowned out the TV in the background. And for the first time in years, I wished my wife were still alive. She would have known what to do. I sat back down at the table, but the roasted chicken on my plate had lost all taste. My fork hovered above the food, my mind spinning. Across from me, Matthew kept talking, something about a new project at the architectural firm where he worked, but his words blurred into static. All I could hear was Tom's voice echoing in my ear. "Somebody is inside your house." I forced a smile, not wanting to alarm my son. "That sounds great, Matt. Really proud of you." My voice sounded hollow, even to me. But Matthew had always been perceptive, even as a boy. He stopped mid-sentence, narrowed his hazel eyes, and leaned forward. "Dad, what's wrong? You've gone pale." I hesitated. A part of me wanted to shield him from it, to pretend it was nothing more than a wrong number or a prank. But another part, the honest part, knew that keeping this secret could put us both in danger. "It's probably nothing," I said carefully. "Tom called. Said he thought he saw someone inside my place. I'm sure it's a mistake. Maybe the cleaning service forgot to switch off the lights." Matthew set his fork down slowly. "Dad, if someone's in your house, you can't just brush it off. You need to call the police." The word police hung between us like a loaded gun. I hated involving them. Ever since Linda, my wife, passed, the house had been my sanctuary. The thought of strangers walking through it, trampling over her photographs, rifling through her things under the guise of investigation, made my stomach turn. "I'll handle it," I said more firmly than I felt. Matthew leaned back, folding his arms. "Handle it? What does that even mean?" "Dad, you can't drive back tonight. It's a 2-hour trip, and you've had wine. At least let me call in a report." I rubbed my temples, feeling the weight of exhaustion press down on me. My son was right. But there was something I hadn't told him, something that made my hesitation even sharper. Last week, an envelope had arrived at my office. No return address, just my name scrawled in jagged letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 words, "You will pay." At first, I dismissed it as some crank's idea of a joke. I'd built a successful financial consulting business, and not everyone had left happy. But now, with someone potentially inside my house, the letter clawed its way back into my memory, demanding attention. I swallowed hard and forced my tone into something reassuring. "Listen, Matt, don't worry. I'll figure it out. Why don't we just finish dinner?" But neither of us picked up our forks again. The laughter and warmth that had filled the room earlier had been replaced by a suffocating silence. I could feel Matthew watching me, his concern thick and unspoken. Finally, he said quietly, "Dad, if you're keeping something from me, now's the time to say it." My throat tightened. He deserved the truth, but how could I burden him with threats he couldn't control? He had his own life, his own battles. Dragging him into mine felt selfish. Instead, I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "I just need you to trust me, son." And for the first time, I realized I wasn't sure if I trusted myself. I told Matthew I would handle it, but the truth was I felt like a man walking a tightrope. After Tom hung up, I sat listening to the house, the clock, the refrigerator, the heater. Ordinary sounds turned suspicious. I went to the powder room and stared at my reflection. Lines at my eyes seemed deeper. I splashed water and tried to steady my hands. The envelope, "You will pay," kept surfacing. Tom described a silhouette moving past the living room window, pausing at the framed wedding photograph. The idea that someone had looked at her picture made my stomach turn. At the table, Matthew asked, "Someone with a grudge?" I told him about Eric Manning, a junior analyst who left bitter after a deal went south. I'd pushed the memory away. Now it crawled back. "I don't want the police rummaging through her things," I said. Linda's letters and the objects on the mantel were residues of our life. Strangers disturbing them felt like a fresh wound. Matthew's practical instincts surfaced. He suggested calling the non-emergency line, getting Tom to stay put, and asking the alarm company to do a camera sweep. We had an old system with one blind spot by the hallway. We'd postponed fixing it for months. That admission felt like a confession. We made a plan. Tom stay outside. I'd call the alarm company. Matthew would draft a report if needed. Action made me feel steadier. Then at 9:20 p.m., Tom texted, "Lights off. Empty. Weird footprints on back porch." The word footprints landed harder than the others. Footprints meant the presence had been close enough to touch the porch, to peer in windows, to observe our life. Footprints turned suspicion into proof. That night, I lay awake thinking about privacy and exposure. Regret threaded my thoughts. Business choices, small neglects in marriage. Grief had hollowed the house and made me less vigilant. Perhaps that allowed someone to cross into my life. Sleep came in fits filled with hands rifling drawers and someone reading Linda's handwriting. I woke with my heart pounding and a resolve settling in my chest. If someone had violated our home, I would not let them treat our memories as curiosities. Morning would bring calls and possibly the police. But tonight, in the thin quiet between dusk and dawn, the first sharp edge of a decision formed. I would find out who had come into our house and why. I thought of Linda's laugh, the way she would have lit a candle and told me to stop worrying. That image steadied me. I promised myself I would not flinch from the truth. Whatever waited behind that porch light, I would face it and reclaim the small sanctuaries she had left me. The search would begin at first light. The next morning, sunlight bled through Matthew's blinds, and I realized I had barely slept. My body felt heavy, but my mind was sharp, restless, alive with a strange urgency. I slipped out of bed quietly, not wanting to wake my son, and made coffee in his small kitchen. The bitter heat steadied my hands. The first call I made was to Tom. He answered on the first ring. "Morning, David," he said, his voice gravelly, like he hadn't slept either. I checked again at dawn. The lights are still off. But those footprints, they're clear as day. Too big to be mine. "Boots?" I asked. "Yeah, work boots, by the look of 'em. Fresh." The ground was damp from last night's rain. My stomach churned. Whoever had been there hadn't just passed by. They had lingered, walked across the back porch, and stood where Linda used to water her gardenias. I hung up and called the alarm company. The operator's cheery, scripted tone grated against the tension in my chest. When she pulled up my account, her voice faltered. Mr. Grant, we logged an alert last night at 8:47 p.m. Living room motion detector. It was marked as dismissed, manual override from your keypad. My grip on the phone tightened. That's impossible. I wasn't home. Sir, the system shows the code was entered correctly. The words hit me like a hammer. Whoever entered my house knew my security code. When Matthew joined me at the table, hair tousled, I laid it out. Tom's footprints, the override, the certainty that this wasn't random. He listened, eyes darkening, jaw clenching in a way that reminded me of his mother. Dad, this isn't just some burglar. Someone's targeting you. I nodded. I know. He leaned forward. You have to tell me everything. Don't hold back. Who could know your code? Who hates you enough to leave threats and break into your house? The letter burned in my memory again. You will pay. But it wasn't just Eric Manning. There were others, disgruntled clients, rivals in the financial field, even family tensions I'd avoided for years. Secrets have a way of festering in silence. I told Matthew about the envelope, my voice low, each word tasting of fear and shame. He sat back, exhaling sharply. You should have told me sooner. I didn't want to drag you into it, I said. You already have. The silence between us grew heavier than the words we hadn't spoken. My son was right. By keeping secrets, I had already put him in danger. Matthew grabbed his jacket. We're driving back today. I'm not letting you face this alone. For a moment, pride swelled in me. He was still my boy, but now he stood as a man beside me. Yet under that pride lay dread, because I wasn't sure I wanted him to see what we might find waiting in that house. As we loaded our bags into his car, a thought pierced through. Whoever knew my code hadn't just broken in. They wanted me to know they had been there. And that meant this was only the beginning. We drove back under a sky the color of old paper, silence pressing between us. Matthew kept glancing at me as if trying to read the map of my face. The block looked ordinary, mowed lawns, a bike on a porch, but the house felt exposed when we pulled in. Tom stood by his truck, eyes rimmed with fatigue. Back door ajar this morning, he said. Figured you'd want to know. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp and something metallic. The living room appeared untouched until I noticed the wedding photo on the mantel was tilted, its dust uneven. Someone had nudged it. Matthew moved through the rooms methodically, checking drawers, flipping cushions, searching the habits we'd embedded into the house. The ceramic bird where we hid the spare key had been shifted. The key wasn't there. We called the police. Officer Rivera arrived with gentle efficiency. He photographed prints, logged the scene, and asked about threats or disgruntled people. I told him about Eric Manning and the anonymous envelope that read, "You will pay." Rivera nodded. We'll canvass the neighborhood and check cameras. Sometimes it's about intimidation more than theft. Tom told us about an unmarked van by the school 2 nights ago, a man inside with a laptop watching houses. The idea of being watched tightened something in my chest. Someone had studied us. We changed the alarm code, sealed the doors, and bagged the photograph as evidence. Matthew set up a streaming camera to cover the living room, arranging it with patient, precise movements that steadied me more than he likely knew. Sitting at the kitchen table, we spread Linda's recipe cards like portraits. Matthew touched one gently. They went through her things, he said. They wanted to see her handwriting. It felt worse than a burglary. This was an intrusion into memory. Whoever had been in our home wasn't looking for valuables. They were searching for traces of us. Sleep that night was thin and jagged. Each small noise made me jolt to alertness. At dawn, Matthew suggested we stay with Tom for a few nights. I agreed, torn between protecting the house and preserving a thread of normalcy. Before leaving, I reread the note. You will pay. The words were blunt, crude, yet they mapped a demand. Someone expected a reaction. We locked the door with the new code and drove away, the house shrinking behind us. For the first time in years, my fear was a shared thing. Matthew's hand brushed mine on the center console, a brief pressure that felt like an anchor. We had pieces, prints, a missing key, a strange van. Whoever had violated our home had left a path. We would follow it. The thought of Linda's laugh echoed unexpectedly, and grief mingled with anger. I vowed not to let the intruder make her memory into a spectacle. This was about more than property. It was about respect and answers. We would interrogate every lead, press on neighbors for details, and not let fear fragment us. If they wanted a reaction, they would meet. We started with small, stubborn steps. First, I called every client I trusted and asked, carefully, if anyone had been agitated lately, if any meetings had gone wrong. Most replies were routine condolences and puzzled silences. Business people have short memories for personal threats. They tend to wash away discomfort with a calendar invite. Still, one name kept surfacing in my mind, Eric Manning. He'd been loud, bitter, and reckless when he left. But he was only a fragment in a larger pattern I could not see yet. Matthew spent the afternoon at the local coffee shop, tapping into neighborhood forums, scrolling through community posts that might mention the unmarked van. He texted neighbors, asked for any doorbell footage, any odd behavior. Persistence, he said, often cracked small mysteries open. That kind of methodical energy had always been his. He treated the problem like a blueprint with missing measurements. I watched him and felt a fierce, quiet pride. That evening, Tom called about the school van again. A teacher had remembered a pale man carrying a laptop. The description was vague. People who observed without a reason rarely recall specifics. But the teacher mentioned a sticker on the van, a faded emblem, half peeled, an emblem that matched nothing we'd seen before. It was enough. We returned to the house with a new plan, document everything, keep our movements predictable to each other, and share information with Officer Rivera. He was careful, professional, and less inclined to dismiss our fear. He promised increased patrols and to check local pawn shops for any oddly specific items. Sometimes the message is the thing, he said, meaning the intimidation more than the theft. That night, Matthew and I went through Linda's things again, slowly, reverently, hoping to understand what the intruder had sought. We found a pressed bookmark between recipe cards, a scribbled grocery list with her handwriting looping like a familiar tune. Whoever had been inside had read those small lines, turned pages where she had rested her hand. The intimacy of that thought unsettled me more than the notion of missing jewelry. I started to imagine motives. Was it revenge for a business decision long ago? A random act by a voyeur with too much time? Or someone closer, someone who knew habits and codes and resentments? The possibilities multiplied and narrowed like hallways in a house I no longer recognized. As days folded into one another, the strain pressed into our conversations. Matthew wanted to hire private security. I balked at the idea, feeling both foolish and exposed by the suggestion. Pride and vulnerability wrestled in my chest. In the end, we compromised: motion-activated lights, better cameras, and a temporary lockbox for Linda's papers. It felt like ceremony, an attempt to reclaim control. Late one night, the doorbell on Matthew's phone chimed. A neighbor had uploaded a short clip from their porch camera. A shadow at the edge of our property, a flash of someone holding something reflective, then retreating into the night. The timestamp matched the hour after Tom's sighting. The clip was grainy but undeniable. We watched it together, my throat tight, my hands trembling. Whoever was watching us was patient and precise. They were also watching for the moment we would react. That image, the shadow holding something reflective, stayed with me. It was a reminder that caution alone would not be enough. We needed to sift motive from menace and trace the outline of a person whose life now intersected ours in the most invasive way. And so we kept looking, each clue a small shovel in a yard of half-buried answers. And the following week stretched like a tight wire between two cliffs. One side held the routine I clung to, the other the unknown I tried to map. Days blurred into calls, check-ins, and small strategic moves. More cameras, neighborhood alerts, Officer Rivera's visits. But beneath the practical work, there was a quieter, more corrosive thing: the feeling of being observed. I caught myself pausing at every window, imagining eyes on the other side of the glass. Matthew threw himself into the search with the intensity of someone redesigning a life. He traced financial records, cross-checked emails I had long forgotten, and pulled credit reports for names that had once been clients. His fingers moved with a certainty I envied. He treated our peril like a structural problem to solve. Watching him work, I felt both gratitude and an old, private ache. How little he'd needed me, yet how quickly he returned when I asked. One evening, as rain thinned on the street, Tom knocked and held up a folded page. "Found this on my fence," he said. Ink smudged, the paper smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. It was a photocopy of our wedding invitation, our names, the church, The date. Someone had taken the trouble to recreate a fragment of our life and leave it where anyone could see. I read the invitation with a hand that trembled. The careful script, the detail of the reception hall. These were things only an intimate observer would know. It felt like a message. We were not merely objects of curiosity. We were the subject of a narrative someone was scripting. The anger that rose inside me was not mere rage. It was a fierce determination to reclaim agency over our story. Officer Rivera broadened the inquiry. He spoke to former clients and past employees, uncovered a terse email thread where I had argued with a consultant over fees, and found a parking receipt from a diner where a man matching the van's description had lingered. It wasn't enough, but suggested leads. Then, a new development, an anonymous voicemail on my office line. The voice was altered. You remember the date. We remember your face. Then silence. The message did more than threaten. It tied itself to a moment in time, our wedding, and suggested someone had been living inside the margins of our life for years. In the quiet after the call, Matthew asked the question that had been lodging like a stone in my throat. Who would want this? To make you hurt like this? I could have answered with business blowbacks, with Eric Manning's bitterness, with every slight I'd ever dished out. But the honest truth crawled out finally. There are people who make obsession their work. They do not seek money. They seek stories. We were learning that the difference between being noticed and being hunted was intent. As the investigation widened, the house felt less like a refuge and more like a stage. Whoever had decided to write our scenes knew how to make us act. We will not be someone else's story now. The city felt smaller as autumn tightened its grip. Leaves browned overnight, and the air tasted like old promises. A new rhythm governed us. Less rush, more scrutiny. Officer Rivera suggested legal steps and extra patrols, and his calm voice became an odd comfort. Patterns began to emerge. The van sightings clustered near the elementary school 2 blocks away, always at dusk. A hooded figure took the same route past our mailbox. Timing suggested planning, not random trespass. I cataloged details. Which hallway light the intruder paused by, which frame was nudged, the faint scent of smoke like a signature. Each small fact mapped a rhythm to the intruder's behavior, a script written for slow unraveling. Matthew's energy intensified. He hired a retired detective named Alvarez, stoic and methodical, who treated obsession like a case file. Alvarez listened to footage, scrutinized parking receipts, and compared handwriting. He found a pawn shop that had bought 2 bronze paperweights engraved with our initials. The shopkeeper described the seller as tall with a limp. The thought that our tokens had been traded away made me sick. We installed new cameras. The footage captured a shadow twice. In the second clip, the figure paused and looked straight at the lens, a deliberate, chilling gesture, being seen and returning that sight. Anger grew with fear. Whoever had once had no claim on our life was attempting to carve one. Officer Rivera broadened the inquiry and posted a bulletin describing the van and the pawnshop sale. The neighborhood murmured. Then Tom found a diner receipt in his mailbox with a scrawled note. Remember the vows. Different handwriting, same cadence. Threads from our past were being stitched into a tapestry of threats. For the first time a shape formed. Someone patient, precise, who mined memory for leverage. I pictured a solitary figure mapping our life with a cold care. The image horrified and focused me. Alvarez insisted we turn attention to motive, who would escalate obsession into harassment. He suggested people who felt erased by a moment, who became storytellers of grievance. We combed old disputes, dismissed emails, and a terse parking receipt from years ago. Not proof, but pattern. We intensified patrols, set traps with sudden light sequences, and left false routines to confuse the watcher. Michael, a neighbor, volunteered footage that showed the van parked for 20 minutes the week before, a man inside watching. Each clue was a small shovel in the yard of answers. At night, I dreamed of hands rifling through drawers, of someone placing our relics on a table and arranging them like trophies. Grief and anger braided into resolve. I thought of Linda's laugh and the way she would have cursed at me for letting the house become a target. That memory steadied me. We would not let someone turn our private life into a stage. We would unmask the person writing our scenes. We would trace every footprint until the story belonged to us again. Alvarez's pawnshop lead narrowed the search into something tangible. The ledger listed a sale, bronze paperweights, one dented, sold by a man with a limp. It felt like a rope we could pull. We coordinated with Officer Rivera. Neighbors were canvassed, footage reviewed frame by frame, receipts cross-checked. Matthew worked through details with the precision of his architectural mind. I kept returning to Linda's photograph, seeking calm in grief. A landlord remembered the renter, polite, solitary, walking with a cane. Rivera obtained a warrant, and we opened the storage unit, as if unearthing a private shrine. Under a faded blanket were our items: paperweights, a recital program, a Polaroid of Linda smiling at a picnic. Each object was proof someone had collected our life. They arrested the man when he returned to the lot. He spoke quietly. He collected memories because he feared losing his own. His apartment held boxes, clippings, and a wall map pinned with our neighborhood. The map felt like an incision, evidence of prolonged watching. At the precinct, his words were both explanation and wound. "I wanted to remember them," he said. Rivera looked away. Alvarez cataloged each piece. The man's motive was not greed, but a lonely compulsion that became invasive. In court, the ledger and the map tied him to possession. The defense argued illness. The prosecution framed intent. Legal language moved around the small, human things: a pressed program, a grocery list in Linda's hand, a Polaroid with torn edges. Each returned item felt like a stitch sewn back into our life. At home, we repaired more than locks. We cleaned drawers, reset frames, and reorganized the mantel with care. Matthew upgraded cameras and lights. He joked about wiring the porch to play Linda's laugh when someone crossed the threshold, a wish to fill the air with what had been taken. The ordeal changed how I saw privacy. I had traded openness for convenience, leaving traces someone could gather. That realization was painful. Sleep remained thin. I waited for ordinary knocks, a neighbor's hello, a delivery. Those small normalities stung because they proved life could be ordinary again. The judge ordered restitution and mandated treatment. It wasn't dramatic vindication, but it set a boundary. He would be kept from our life and required to get help. That outcome, imperfect as it was, allowed us to start repair. That night I sat with Linda's recipe cards. The scent of flour seemed to anchor memory. Matthew handed me a mug and squeezed my hand. "We did the right thing," he said. The peace that followed was careful but real. We had evidence, a name, and a narrative reclaimed. The work ahead would be small and domestic. One recipe, one photograph, one evening at a time. I promised Linda, clumsily and loudly, that I would guard these ordinary moments, build a quieter armor from routine and small joys, and make our home a place where laughter could return, unhurried and unafraid. The trial moved slowly, like everything in the legal system, but life at home shifted quickly. The police had returned our belongings, and Matthew and I spent an entire Saturday restoring the house. We dusted frames, rehung photos, reshelved Linda's cookbooks. Every small act felt ceremonial, as if we were reclaiming our ground inch by inch. When I set her favorite ceramic bird back on the mantel, Matthew paused beside me. "Dad, do you think this is really over?" His voice carried both hope and dread. I wanted to give him certainty. Instead, I gave him honesty. Over? No, but contained. And sometimes that's all we can ask for. Containment wasn't closure, though. Nights still brought shadows I couldn't shake. I kept dreaming of someone standing at the window, watching, silent. Even when I woke to an empty yard, the feeling lingered. That's when Alvarez suggested therapy, not as weakness, but as maintenance, the way you tune an engine before a long trip. Reluctantly, I agreed. Sitting across from a stranger in a quiet office, I found words I hadn't spoken aloud in years. I admitted how Linda's absence had hollowed the house, how pride had kept me from leaning on Matthew, how guilt gnawed at me for exposing him to danger. The therapist didn't rush me. She simply asked, "What do you want to protect, your memories or your son?" The answer was both, and admitting it released something I hadn't realized I carried. Meanwhile, Matthew grew more protective, almost to the point of paranoia. He double-checked the locks, studied footage at odd hours, and lingered in doorways as if guarding me from unseen threats. One night, I pulled him aside. "Matt, you can't lose yourself to this. We can't let him take more from us than he already has." He looked at me with eyes so like his mother's it made my chest ache. "I'm not losing myself, Dad. I'm finding out how much I care about what's left." Those words stayed with me. For years, I believed my son lived on the periphery of my world, too busy building his own. But here he was, standing shoulder to shoulder with me, refusing to let the house, or me, be defined by fear. Rivera called to say sentencing was scheduled. Probation, mandated treatment, restrictions on proximity. It wasn't the ironclad justice I craved, but it was law's version of balance. Sometimes, Rivera said, justice is less about punishment and more about boundaries. Boundaries. That was the word. Our lives had been breached, but now we had lines again. They might not hold forever, but they were something. That evening, Matthew and I cooked one of Linda's recipes together. Garlic bread and her famous lasagna, the kitchen steaming with comfort. We ate at the table where it all began, where Tom's call had shattered the illusion of safety. And yet, as we laughed at a burnt edge of pasta, I realized something. Fear hadn't won. It had tried to steal our home, our memories, our story. But in the end, we were still here, eating, laughing, remembering. Together. The sentencing came and went in a quiet courtroom that smelled of paper and disinfectant. The man who had haunted our nights sat at the defense table, thinner than I remembered from the booking photo. He stared at the floor most of the time, his limp more noticeable under the weight of shackles. The judge spoke calmly, words like probation, treatment, and supervised release floating through the air like fragments. No drama, no fireworks, just procedure. And yet, when the gavel struck, I felt a chapter turn. Matthew squeezed my shoulder as we walked out. "That's it?" he asked, half frustrated, half relieved. "That's it," I said. But inside, I wasn't sure if endings were ever that clean. Back home, the silence felt different. Not the sharp silence of fear, but the uncertain quiet of aftermath. I moved slowly through each room, touching frames, straightening books, letting my fingers linger on the piano keys Linda once played. Everything felt returned, but not restored. The house carried scars now, invisible but real. I began a new ritual. Every morning, I wrote in a notebook before coffee. Sometimes only a line, sometimes a page, but always something. It was a way to reclaim narrative, to tell the story on my terms. Today the house is still mine. Today I laughed with my son. Small declarations, yet they steadied me. Matthew noticed. One evening he asked, "Does writing help?" "It does," I admitted. "It keeps me from feeling like someone else is telling our story." He nodded. "Then keep going." Maybe that's what he wanted, to take control of the story. Don't let him. Tom, ever watchful, came by with beers and sat on the porch with us. "Neighborhood feels safer again," he said. "But keep those lights up, just in case." His loyalty had been a quiet backbone through all of this. Yet even as normalcy crept back, shadows lingered. I caught myself double-checking the locks at night, watching strangers on the street with suspicion. Trauma doesn't vanish, it embeds. Still, there was progress. The laughter at dinner was easier now. The air inside the house felt lighter. One night, as Matthew packed to head back to Columbus, I felt a wave of panic. The idea of him leaving after weeks of shared vigilance clawed at me. "You don't have to rush back," I said. He smiled. "Dad, I'll visit every weekend. You're not alone in this. Not anymore." After he drove away, the house was quiet again, but not empty. I felt Linda's presence in the framed photos, in the recipes, in the echoes of laughter we had rebuilt. For the first time, I realized solitude didn't have to mean isolation. The man who broke in had tried to define me by fear, but all he had done was remind me of what I had left: resilience, memory, and a son who still cared enough to stand beside me. And that, I thought as I turned off the porch light, was enough to keep going. The weeks after Matthew returned to Columbus were strange, like learning how to walk on a leg that had just healed. The house was quiet again, but the silence no longer pressed on my chest. Instead, it gave me room to think. I filled the mornings with small routines: watering the garden, opening the blinds wide, brewing coffee strong enough to wake the whole block. I wanted to reclaim the ordinary, to prove to myself that my life was not defined by shadows. Still, there were moments when the fear surfaced. A knock at the door after sunset made my pulse leap. A parked car across the street had me peeking through the blinds twice. But now I had tools: the new cameras, the upgraded locks, the knowledge that I could call Rivera or Alvarez if I needed to. And most of all, I had Matthew checking in every night. Our phone calls became a ritual. He'd talk about blueprints and stubborn clients. I'd talk about the garden or the latest book I'd picked up. Simple conversations, yet they anchored us. One Saturday, Matthew drove back and brought blueprints under his arm. "I've been thinking," he said, spreading them on the kitchen table. "What if we redesign the house, just parts of it? Stronger locks, better sight lines, more light. We can make it safer, but also fresher." I looked at the lines on the paper. New windows, an open porch, skylights above the living room. The idea stirred something I hadn't felt in years, the possibility of change, a future. "Linda would have liked this," I murmured. Matthew smiled. "Then let's do it for her, and for us." The project became our shared language. He sketched, I approved or vetoed, and together we began planning not just repairs, but renewal. For once, the house wasn't a shrine to loss or a target for fear. It became a canvas for rebuilding. One evening, Tom stopped by to see the sketches. "Looks good," he said, tapping the paper. "But don't forget to leave space for living, not just protecting." His words struck me. Protection had been my obsession, but living, that was the point of all of this. The deeper change, though, was inside me. For months I had been reacting, retreating, defending. Now I found myself imagining again, imagining dinners with friends, imagining laughter echoing through the hall, imagining my son bringing his own family one day. Fear had stolen imagination from me. Reclaiming it felt like freedom. That night, I opened the notebook I'd been writing in. Instead of my usual line, "Today the house is still mine," I wrote, "Tomorrow the house will be more than mine. It will be ours." And for the first time, I felt not just like a survivor, but like a man beginning again. Construction began with the sound of hammers and saws, the kind of noise that normally annoyed neighbors, but, to me, felt like music. Each strike of a nail was a declaration. This house belongs to us again. Matthew coordinated with the crew, walking the perimeter with blueprints tucked under his arm, explaining sight lines and structural reinforcements. I hovered at first, unsure if I was helping or simply getting in the way, but eventually I found small tasks, handing over tools, sweeping sawdust, brewing coffee for the workers. The changes came fast. Walls opened to let in more light. The porch extended so we could see the street clearly, and skylights carved the darkness from the living room ceiling. The old locks were replaced with new deadbolts, and the alarm company installed a system so advanced it practically spoke back. But the most meaningful addition was a garden window in the kitchen. Linda had always wanted one, a space to grow herbs and flowers year-round. When I saw it installed, sun spilling through, I felt like I'd finally given her something she had asked for long ago. At night, the house looked different. Where shadows once pooled, light now spilled freely. I caught myself smiling at corners that had once made me tense. Fear had lived in those corners, now possibility did. But the reconstruction did more than change the building. It reshaped me. I started walking the neighborhood again, greeting people I had avoided before. Tom and I shared more evenings on the porch, sometimes in silence, sometimes trading stories about years gone by. The house no longer isolated me. It connected me. One afternoon, Matthew caught me staring at the new kitchen window. "You okay, Dad?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, for the first time in a long while. I think I'm more than okay." He grinned. "Then it's working." Still, the past wasn't erased. I kept the notebook by my bed and continued writing. My entries shifted. No longer just about survival, but about gratitude. Today, I planted basil in Linda's window. Today, I laughed with Tom until my chest hurt. These words became evidence of a life reclaimed. The trial's memory still lingered, of course. The man with the limp, his quiet explanations, the way he had tried to make our lives part of his collection. Sometimes I wondered if he thought of us still, but I refused to let him occupy more of my days. He had taken enough. One evening, as Matthew and I sat on the new porch, he asked softly, "Do you think Mom would be proud of us?" I didn't hesitate. Yes, not because of what we built, but because of how we kept going. The sun dipped low, painting the street gold. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something bad to happen. I felt like I was waiting for life to keep unfolding. The house was no longer a fortress, but a gathering place. The first time I invited people over after the renovations, I felt my pulse race. It wasn't just neighbors, it was a step into vulnerability. Tom came with his wife. Matthew brought colleagues from Columbus. Even Officer Rivera stopped by off-duty, carrying a bottle of wine like an old friend. For years I had avoided company, protecting grief like a fragile heirloom. But that evening, laughter filled the living room, bouncing off the skylights, blending with the smell of fresh lasagna from Linda's recipe cards. At one point, I stood back and watched. Rivera talking with Tom, Matthew smiling at his friends, people leaning against the new kitchen window as if it had always been there. I realized the house was alive again, not a museum of loss, but a living space. For so long I had feared letting anyone near it. Now, it felt right to share. After the guests left, Matthew lingered. He looked at me with that same perceptive expression he'd had since boyhood. "Dad, you're different. Lighter." "Maybe I finally let the house breathe," I said. He nodded. "And maybe you let yourself breathe, too." That night, I sat on the porch with my notebook. The entry was longer than usual. Today the house was full. Today I heard Mom's laughter in the way others laughed. Today I stopped protecting grief and started protecting life. The days that followed were quieter, but not lonely. I found myself walking into town, stopping at the diner for breakfast, talking to people I hadn't spoken to in years. They knew pieces of the story. News travels fast in a suburb, but no one pressed. They just welcomed me back into the rhythm of ordinary life. Of course, shadows still tried to creep in. A car parked too long outside stirred my nerves. The sound of boots on the sidewalk at night brought back images of footprints on the porch. But instead of spiraling, I called Rivera or simply noted it and let it go. Fear didn't vanish, but it no longer ruled me. One Sunday, Matthew asked if I'd join him in Columbus for a lecture he was giving. Sitting in that auditorium, listening to him speak with confidence, I realized how much I had underestimated his strength. He wasn't just my son. He was a man who had carried me through the darkest stretch of my life. Driving back that night, I looked at the stars spread wide above the highway. For the first time, I thought about the future, not just surviving it, but shaping it. I thought of Linda's unfinished dreams, of Matthew's unfolding ones, and of my own. Back home, I wrote one more line in my notebook before bed. Tomorrow is not something to fear. Tomorrow is something to build. Autumn gave way to winter, and with it came a stillness that felt different from the stillness of fear. Snow layered gently on rooftops, muffling the streets in white, and for the first time in years I didn't see that silence as a threat. It was peace. Matthew visited often, sometimes staying the night, sometimes just long enough for coffee and a game of cards. Each visit reminded me of the bond we had reforged through the storm. He no longer looked at me as the father who tried to hold everything together, but as a man willing to admit he had been afraid. And maybe that made me stronger in his eyes. One evening, as the snow fell outside the new garden window, I lit a candle and opened Linda's recipe box. The smell of rosemary and garlic filled the kitchen, and with it came memories, not heavy with grief anymore, but softened by gratitude. I realized that remembering didn't have to be painful. It could be a way of carrying her forward. Tom dropped by with a bottle of bourbon. We sat on the porch, bundled against the cold, sipping slowly as we watched flakes drift under the streetlight. "Funny thing about storms," he said, his voice low. "They strip you down, but they also show you what holds." I nodded. "And sometimes what holds is stronger than you thought." After he left, I walked through the house. Every corner told a different story now. The new skylights let moonlight spill across the living room. The porch gave me sight lines I hadn't had before. And Linda's herbs, basil, thyme, parsley, grew stubbornly green in the garden window, a living reminder of what she had once wanted. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote, "This house is no longer only mine. It is Matthew's, it is Linda's, it is everyone who walks through its doors. It is not a fortress. It is a home." Lying in bed, I realized how much had changed. The man with the limp had tried to script our lives, to make us actors in his obsession. But in the end, he had given us something he never intended: clarity. He forced us to face what mattered, to protect memory without being trapped by it, to lean on one another, to live openly despite risk. As I drifted toward sleep, I thought of Linda. Not the way she looked in photos, but the way she laughed when Matthew made a joke, the way she hummed when she cooked, the way she'd press her hand to mine when words weren't enough. That memory was no longer a wound. It was a gift. Tomorrow, Matthew and I would start on the backyard, planting the trees Linda had always dreamed of. Maybe in spring, their blossoms would stretch toward the sky, a testament not to fear, but to resilience. And as snow blanketed the roof and the world outside lay still, I felt something I hadn't in years: safe, hopeful, alive.